The late afternoon sun hung low over Cedar Ridge, casting long shadows across the dusty platform of the train station. The westbound had just wheezed to a stop, black smoke billowing from its stack like a tired old dragon catching its breath. Margaret Sullivan stood at the top of the passenger car steps, clutching a small terrier to her chest with one arm while the other gripped a carpet bag that had seen better days. She was not what the townsfolk had expected. "Lord have mercy," whispered Mrs. Abigail Foster, the banker's wife, fanning herself despite the October chill. "Is that the mail-order bride Thomas Morrison sent for?" "Can't be," muttered her companion, Miss Prudence Wright, the milliner's daughter. "Thomas said she was comely, said her photograph showed a right pretty thing," but there was no denying it. The woman descending the train steps was Margaret Sullivan of Philadelphia, and she bore little resemblance to whatever image had been sent months ago. Her traveling dress, once navy blue, had faded to the color of old dishwater. The fabric strained across her full figure, and dust had settled into every fold and seam. Her brown hair, pinned up in what must have been a tidy arrangement 3 days ago, now hung in tired wisps around a round face flushed from the journey. The little dog in her arms, a scraggly thing with wiry gray fur, let out a nervous whine as Margaret's boot touched the platform. She steadied herself, squaring her shoulders against the weight of 24 stairs. "That's her, all right," said Jake Henderson, the station master, checking his manifest. "Says right here, M. Sullivan, Philadelphia. 1 trunk, 1 carpet bag, 1 dog." The crowd that had gathered, as crowds always did when the weekly train arrived, began to murmur. In a town like Cedar Ridge, population 300 souls, a mail-order bride was news. A mail-order bride who looked like this was scandal. Margaret's eyes swept the platform, searching. She had memorized Thomas Morrison's last letter, could recite it word for word. "I'll be there when your train arrives, my dear Margaret. Look for a tall man in a brown hat with a red band. That'll be me." But there was no tall man. No brown hat. No Thomas. "Perhaps he's been delayed," she said quietly to the station master, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "Mr. Thomas Morrison, do you know where I might find him?" Jake Henderson's weathered face went still. He removed his cap, worried the brim between his fingers. "Ma'am, that is to say..." He glanced helplessly at the crowd, as if someone might rescue him from this duty. It was Reverend Coleman who stepped forward, his black coat dusty from his walk to the station. "Miss Sullivan, I presume?" His voice was gentle, the voice he used for funerals and sick beds. "I'm afraid I bear difficult news. Thomas Morrison. There was an accident. 5 days past. A horse threw him out near Devil's Canyon." The words seemed to come from very far away. Margaret's arms tightened around Chester, her little dog, her only friend on the long journey west. "An accident? He didn't survive, ma'am. We buried him Tuesday last." The platform tilted. Or perhaps it was Margaret who swayed. Someone, she never knew who, pushed a wooden crate behind her, and she sank onto it gracelessly, her traveling dress billowing around her like a deflated balloon. Dead. Thomas Morrison was dead. The man who had written such beautiful letters, who had promised her a new life, a little house with yellow curtains, a garden where she could grow roses like her mother used to. Dead before she could even meet him. "Well," said Mrs. Foster, not bothering to lower her voice, "what's to be done with her now?" "Send her back, I suppose," Miss Wright replied. "Though Lord knows where she'll get the fare. Doesn't look like she has 2 pennies to rub together." Margaret heard every word. In Philadelphia, she'd been a burden to her brother and his wife after their parents died. Too plain to marry, too educated to be content with factory work, too proud to beg. Thomas Morrison's advertisement in the Matrimonial Times had seemed like salvation. Seeking respectable woman of good character for correspondence and marriage. Must be willing to relocate to Colorado territory. Appearance immaterial, kindness essential. She'd sent her photograph, an old one, from before the fever that had taken her parents and left her health fragile, her body changed. She'd been honest about everything else, though. Her love of books, her skill with needlework, her way with animals. Thomas had written back immediately, and for 6 months they had exchanged letters full of dreams and plans. Now those dreams lay buried in Cedar Ridge Cemetery alongside a man she'd never met. The woman can't sit there all day, someone muttered. Disgraceful, added another voice. Coming all this way under false pretenses. False pretenses, Margaret's head snapped up, her gray eyes flashing. I beg your pardon? Mrs. Foster sniffed. Well, you clearly misrepresented yourself. Poor Thomas, God rest his soul, was expecting a bride, not what? Margaret stood slowly, Chester still clutched to her chest. Not a woman who traveled 3,000 miles to marry a man who valued kindness over appearance. Not someone who sold everything she owned for train fare because she believed in the promise of a new life. Her voice carried across the platform, silencing the whispers. Even the wind seemed to pause. Thomas Morrison knew exactly who I was, she continued, chin raised. We wrote to each other for 6 months. He knew my circumstances, my appearance, everything. If you must speak ill of someone, I'll thank you not to do it of a man who can no longer defend himself. Reverend Coleman cleared his throat. Now, let's all remember our Christian charity. Miss Sullivan has suffered a terrible shock. Is there perhaps a boarding house where she might stay until arrangements can be made? Mrs. Hutchins's place is full up, someone called out. Cattle drivers came through yesterday. The hotel, then? The Reverend suggested. On what money? Mrs. Foster asked pointedly. Besides, it wouldn't be proper. A single woman alone. Margaret watched this discussion of her fate as if from a great distance. Chester wiggled in her arms, wanting down, but she didn't dare let him go. He was all she had left now, him and a trunk full of carefully mended dresses and hope-filled letters from a dead man. The crowd was growing restless. The evening stage would be leaving soon, and there were supplies to collect, gossip to spread. The despised bride, for that's what she was now, she could see it in their faces, was already becoming more story than person. I'll take her in. The voice came from the edge of the crowd. Heads turned as a man stepped forward, leading a paint horse. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate simple, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that might have been handsome if it ever smiled. His clothes were clean but worn. Canvas pants, a blue work shirt, leather vest scarred from use. Everything about him spoke of practicality, of a man who had no time for foolishness. Samuel Morrison, Reverend Coleman said, relief evident in his voice. I was hoping you'd come. Margaret's heart lurched. Morrison. This was Thomas's brother then, the one he'd mentioned who ran the ranch alone since their parents died, the one who kept to himself and didn't hold much with town ways. Samuel Morrison looked at Margaret with eyes the color of winter sage, taking in her travel-stained dress, her wind-blown hair, the desperate way she clutched her little dog. His expression revealed nothing. You're the woman my brother sent for, he said. It wasn't a question. I am. Margaret lifted her chin, preparing for another dose of scorn. Margaret Sullivan. He nodded once, then turned to Jake Henderson. Her trunk. Just there, Sam. Without another word, Samuel Morrison hefted the trunk onto his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. He carried it to a wagon waiting behind his horse, set it in the bed with surprising gentleness. You coming? He asked Margaret. She blinked. Where? Ranch is 12 miles out. Best get moving if we want to make it before dark. But I don't understand. Your brother was... She couldn't say the word again. Dead, yes. His voice was flat, matter-of-fact. Doesn't change the fact that you came all this way on his word. Ranch has a guest room. You can stay there tonight. Figure out what you want to do come morning. It wasn't kindness, exactly. More like duty, the way a man might pick up a stray calf in a storm. But it was better than the platform, better than the stares and whispers. Margaret stood, her legs unsteady after 3 days on the train. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. I don't want to be a burden. Something flickered across his face. Annoyance, pity. It was gone before she could name it. Can you climb up, or do you need help? Pride stiffened her spine. I can manage. But the wagon was high, her skirts were heavy, and Chester chose that moment to squirm. She made an awkward attempt, nearly dropping the dog, her carpet bag banging against the wheel. Without a word, Samuel Morrison stepped forward. He plucked Chester from her arms, set the little dog carefully in the wagon bed. Then, with the same practical efficiency, He gripped Margaret's waist and lifted her onto the seat as if she weighed no more than a sack of flour. The crowd watched in silence as he climbed up beside her, taking the reins. "Sam," Reverend Coleman called. "Will we see you both at services Sunday?" Samuel Morrison's jaw tightened. "Doubt it, Reverend." He clicked to the horses and the wagon lurched forward. Margaret gripped the seat, acutely aware of the eyes following them down Main Street. She caught snatches of conversation carried on the wind. "Poor Sam, saddled with her now. Did you see the size of her? That dog looks like a drowned rat." "The despised bride," someone laughed. "That's what we'll call her." Margaret kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, but her hands trembled where they clutched her carpetbag. Beside her, Samuel Morrison drove in silence, his profile carved from stone. As they passed the last building in town, a sagging barn that marked the edge of civilization, Margaret finally spoke. "You didn't have to do this." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." "Then why?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Thomas wrote about you. Every letter for 6 months, nothing but Margaret this, Margaret that. How you could recite poetry and bake apple pie and train dogs to dance. How you made him laugh." His hands tightened on the reins. He was happy. Happier than I'd seen him since the folks died. Figured the least I could do was offer you a roof for a night. Margaret's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. Not here, not in front of this stone-faced stranger. "He told me about you too," she said softly. "Said you were the best horseman in 3 counties. Said you could track a butterfly through a blizzard if you had a mind to." Samuel made a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so bitter. Thomas always did see the best in folks. They rode in silence after that, the wagon wheels creaking a lonely rhythm. Chester curled up in the wagon bed, exhausted from the journey. The sun sank lower, painting the mountains crimson and gold. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Margaret Sullivan, the despised bride, rolled toward an uncertain future with a man who didn't want her there, carrying nothing but a trunk full of memories and a broken heart. She'd come west for love and found only gravestone. But she was here now, 3,000 miles from everything she'd known, with nowhere else to go. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, brown grass rippling like an ocean in the wind. And Margaret, despite everything, felt a tiny spark of something that might have been hope. After all, she'd come this far. The Morrison ranch sat in a valley between 2 ridges, sheltered from the worst of the prairie winds. As the wagon crested the final hill, Margaret saw it spread before them in the dying light. A main house of weathered timber, a barn that had seen better days, a few outbuildings scattered like afterthoughts. Smoke rose from the chimney, the only sign of warmth in that vast, empty landscape. Samuel Morrison had spoken perhaps 10 words during the 2-hour journey. Margaret had given up attempting conversation after her 3rd unanswered question about the local weather. Now, as they rolled into the yard, she felt the full weight of her situation settle upon her shoulders like a lead blanket. "House is there," Samuel said unnecessarily, nodding toward the main building. "Guest rooms at the back, privies behind the house, wells by the kitchen door." He pulled the wagon up near the porch, set the brake, and climbed down without ceremony. Margaret gathered her skirts, preparing for another graceless descent, but he was already there, reaching up with the same impersonal efficiency he'd shown in town. His hands were firm on her waist, lowering her to the ground as if she were a piece of freight to be unloaded. Chester jumped down after her, immediately beginning to investigate this new territory with his tail high and curious. "Chester," Margaret called softly, "stay close." The little dog ignored her, as he often did, trotting toward the barn with great interest. "He always mind that well?" Samuel asked dryly, hefting her trunk from the wagon bed. "He has an independent spirit," Margaret replied, defensiveness creeping into her voice. "He's quite intelligent, actually. He can— Open the door, would you?" She pressed her lips together and did as asked. The house smelled of wood smoke and coffee, leather and the faint mustiness of a place lived in by one person who didn't much care for airing things out. It was clean enough, she supposed, but bare. No curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floors, no pictures on the walls. Just the necessary furniture and a coldness that had nothing to do with temperature. Samuel carried her trunk down a narrow hallway to a room at the back. It was small but adequate. A bed with a faded quilt, a washstand, a single chair. A window looked out toward the mountains, now purple shadows against the darkening sky. "This was my mother's sewing room," he said, setting the trunk at the foot of the bed. "Haven't had cause to use it since she passed?" "When was that?" Margaret asked gently. 3 years. His voice suggested the topic was closed. "There's stew on the stove if you're hungry. Help yourself. I've got stock to tend." He turned to leave, but Margaret's voice stopped him. "Mr. Morrison?" He paused in the doorway, not turning around. "What am I to do tomorrow?" His shoulders tensed. "That's for you to figure, Miss Sullivan. I said you could stay the night. Come morning, we'll see about getting you back to town. Maybe someone heading east can take you to the railway station in Pueblo. I have no money for passage home." "Then I guess you'll need to figure something else." He still wouldn't look at her. "Maybe the Reverend can take up a collection." The idea of being a charity case, of having those sneering faces from the platform pass around a hat for the despised bride, made Margaret's stomach turn. "I can work," she said quickly. "I can cook, clean, mend. I kept house for my brother's family in Philadelphia. I don't need a housekeeper." His voice was flat, final. "And I sure don't need—" He stopped himself, but Margaret could fill in the rest. He didn't need a woman here, especially not one his brother had sent for, especially not one who looked like her. "I understand," she said quietly. He left without another word. A moment later, she heard the front door close with more force than necessary. Margaret sank onto the bed, suddenly exhausted. The quilt smelled of lavender and dust, as if someone had tucked sachets in the chest where it was stored and then forgotten about them. She thought of Thomas's letters, how he'd written about his mother's quilts, her garden, her apple pie. This room had been hers, this quilt made by her hands. A woman now 3 years dead, like the son who'd wanted to bring Margaret here. A scratching at the door roused her. Chester had found his way inside and now wanted her attention. She let him in, and he immediately jumped on the bed, circling 3 times before settling against her hip. "Well, boy," she murmured, stroking his wiry fur, "we've gotten ourselves into quite a situation, haven't we?" Chester's response was to yawn widely and close his eyes. Margaret knew she should go eat something. The smell of stew was making her stomach growl, but the thought of venturing into Samuel Morrison's kitchen felt like trespassing. Still, she'd eaten nothing since the stale biscuit and coffee at the last station stop this morning. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. The kitchen was as spare as the rest of the house. A large stove dominated one wall, a scarred wooden table sat in the middle, and shelves held a basic collection of dishes and supplies. The stew pot simmered on the back of the stove. Margaret found a bowl and spoon, served herself, and sat at the table to eat. It was good chunks of beef and vegetables and rich gravy, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify. Either Samuel Morrison could cook, or someone had taught him well. She was halfway through the bowl when the door opened, and he returned, bringing with him the scent of horses and hay. He stopped short at seeing her there, as if he'd forgotten she existed. "I'm sorry," Margaret began, starting to rise. "I should have waited." "Sit down." He moved to the stove, filled his own bowl. "I said help yourself, didn't I?" They ate in silence, the only sound the clink of spoons against pottery. Margaret noticed his hands scarred from work, one finger bent at an odd angle as if it had been broken and healed wrong. He ate methodically, like a man who viewed food as fuel, nothing more. "This is very good," she ventured. He grunted, which she took as acknowledgement. "Did you make it yourself?" "Who else would—" She fell silent again. This was worse than the wagon ride. At least there, the scenery had provided distraction. Here, in the lamplight, she was acutely aware of every sound, every movement, of how her dress pulled tight when she lifted her spoon, of how he steadfastly avoided looking at her. When he finished, he stood and carried his bowl to the dry sink. "I rise at 4:30, he said, his back to her. "I'll take you to town after morning chores. Should get you there by noon." "All right." He started to leave, then paused. "Your dog. He stays inside tonight. Coyotes have been bold lately." It was the closest thing to concern he'd shown. "Thank you. I'll keep him with me." Samuel nodded and left. Margaret heard his boots on the stairs, a door closing somewhere above. She finished her stew, washed both bowls carefully, and banked the stove fire the way her mother had taught her. Everything exactly as she'd found it, as if she'd never been there at all. Back in the small room, she unpacked only what she'd need for the night. No point in settling in. She'd be gone tomorrow, somehow. Perhaps she could find work in town. Surely someone needed a seamstress or a teacher or something. Anything but going back to Philadelphia, to her brother's disapproving wife, in their cramped apartment where she'd been nothing but another mouth to feed. She changed into her nightgown, a practical flannel thing that had seen too many washings. Chester curled at her feet as she sat on the bed, brushing out her hair. In the mirror above the washstand, she caught sight of herself and quickly looked away. No wonder Samuel Morrison couldn't bear to look at her. No wonder the whole town had stared and whispered. She'd been pretty once, before the fever. Not beautiful, but pleasant enough. Slim and neat, with bright eyes and quick smile. But the illness that had taken her parents had left its mark on her too. The weight that wouldn't leave no matter how little she ate. The tired look that never quite left her face. The way her body had betrayed her, becoming something soft and heavy and wrong. Thomas hadn't cared. His letters had been full of plans and dreams, never once mentioning appearance after that first exchange of photographs. "What matters is a kind heart," he'd written. "Someone to share the burdens and the blessings." But Thomas was dead, and his brother clearly didn't share his philosophy. A sound from somewhere in the house made her freeze, footsteps above, pacing, back and forth, like a caged animal. She thought of Samuel Morrison up there, probably wishing he'd left her at the station, counting the hours until he could be rid of her. The footsteps stopped. The house settled into silence. Margaret blew out the lamp and lay down fully dressed. She'd sleep on top of the covers. It didn't seem right to crawl beneath that lavender-scented quilt made by a dead woman for a room her son would never use. Chester pressed against her side, a small, warm comfort in the darkness. Sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept circling back to the platform, to the faces and voices, the despised bride. That's what she was now. Not Margaret Sullivan, who could recite Wordsworth and Milton, who'd won the county fair ribbon for her needlework 3 years running, who'd once dreamed of opening her own school. Just the despised bride, the woman too homely for a dead man. Somewhere in the walls, a mouse scurried. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows. And still those footsteps above, starting and stopping, as if Samuel Morrison couldn't find peace either. Near midnight, exhaustion finally won. Margaret dozed fitfully, dreaming of trains and platforms and faces that laughed and pointed. She woke once to Chester growling low in his throat, but when she listened, she heard nothing but wind and the settling of old wood. Morning came too soon, announced by the sound of boots on the stairs. 4:30, just as he'd said. Margaret rose, splashed cold water on her face, and tried to make herself presentable. Her traveling dress was beyond help, but it was all she had that was suitable for town. She pinned up her hair, pinched her cheeks for color, and wondered why she bothered. The kitchen was warm, the stove already stoked. Coffee perked on the back burner, and the smell made her stomach clench with hunger. Samuel sat at the table, a cup before him, studying what looked like ledgers by lamplight. He glanced up when she entered, then immediately backed down. "Coffee's ready." "Thank you." She poured herself a cup, added the small amount of sugar she found in a bowl. No cream, apparently. "Is there anything I can make for breakfast?" "I don't eat breakfast." "Oh." She sipped her coffee, unsure whether to sit or stand. Chester solved the problem by trotting in and going straight to Samuel, tail wagging. "Your dog's an optimist," Samuel said dryly, as Chester put his paws on his knee, begging for attention. "He likes everyone." Margaret called Chester back, embarrassed. "I'm sorry, Chester, come here." But Samuel was already scratching behind the dog's ears, his face softening just a fraction. "Had a dog like this when I was a boy. Terrier mix, best ratter in the county." It was the most personal thing he'd said. Margaret ventured, "Chester's quite good with mice. My landlady in Philadelphia said, She stopped. Samuel had withdrawn his hand, his face closing off again. Whatever moment had existed was gone. "I'll be ready to leave in an hour," he said, standing. "Best pack your things." He left Chester whining after him. Margaret finished her coffee in solitude, then returned to pack her meager belonging. Everything fit too easily back in the trunk, as if her presence here had made no impression at all. She was sitting on the porch with Chester when Samuel brought the wagon around. The sunrise painted the mountains gold and rose, beautiful enough to break her heart. She dreamed of mornings like this, waking beside Thomas, building a life in this vast, wild country. Instead, she was leaving before she'd even arrived. Samuel loaded her trunk without comment, but when he turned to help her into the wagon, he paused, frowning. "What's wrong?" she asked. He shook his head, jaw tight. "Nothing. Let's go." But he didn't move, just stood there, one hand on the wagon wheel, staring at nothing, or perhaps at everything. The mountains, the awakening prairie, the house where he lived alone with his ghosts. Mr. Morrison? He loved this place, Samuel said suddenly. Thomas loved it like our father did. Always talking about improvements, about building something that would last. Had it all planned out, where the new barn would go, how he'd expand the garden, where his children would play. His voice roughened. Wouldn't shut up about it, drove me half mad with his dreaming. Margaret's throat tightened. He wrote about those dreams. They were beautiful. Dreams. Samuel spat the word like it tasted bitter. Dreams don't mend fences or bring in hay. Dreams don't keep cattle from freezing or wells from running dry. Dreams are what get men killed, making them careless. Is that what happened? He was careless. Samuel's hand clenched on the wagon wheel. He was riding fence in Devil's Canyon. Horse spooked at a rattler. Any other day Thomas would have kept his seat, but his mind was elsewhere, probably composing another letter to you in his head. The accusation in his tone was unmistakable. Margaret felt it like a physical blow. "You blame me." "I blame—" He stopped, breathing hard. "I blame a lot of things, Miss Sullivan, none of them worth discussing." He reached to help her up, but Margaret stepped back. "No." "What?" "I said no. I won't go to town just to be stared at and pitied and made into a scandal for their entertainment. I won't go back to Philadelphia to be a burden again. I came here to work, Mr. Morrison, to build something. If not with Thomas, then—" She lifted her chin. "Then I'll find another way. There is no other way. This is cattle country, Miss Sullivan. It's no place for someone like me?" She laughed, sharp and bitter. "Yes, I gathered that from the welcoming committee yesterday. But I'm here, and I have skills, and I'll be damned if I'll—" She caught herself, modified her language. "I'll be darned if I'll run away just because I'm not what anyone expected." Samuel stared at her like she'd grown a second head. "You can't stay here." "I'm not asking to stay here. I'm asking for time to find another solution. A day or two to inquire about work in town. I can pay for my keep. I'll cook, clean, whatever you need. Just, please." Her voice cracked on the last word. "I've come too far to give up now." The morning stretched between them, full of bird song and possibility, and the weight of unspoken things. Samuel Morrison looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. Not at her body or her plain face, but at her, the woman who'd traveled 3,000 miles on a promise, who'd stood up to the town gossips, who was standing up to him now, trembling but determined. "The house needs cleaning," he said finally, "and I'm tired of my own cooking." Margaret blinked. What? 3 days, he said. "You can stay 3 days. Cook, clean, whatever you think needs doing. After that, you find other arrangements, and you stay out of my way." He turned and walked back toward the barn, leaving Margaret standing beside the loaded wagon in the morning light. "Well," she said to Chester, who was busy investigating a beetle, "I suppose that's something. 3 days. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had 5 minutes ago. She could work miracles in 3 days if she had to. And somehow, looking at that stark house against the endless sky, Margaret Sullivan thought she just might have to. Margaret Sullivan had cleaned houses before, but nothing quite like the Morrison Ranch. It wasn't filthy. Samuel kept things functional, but it had the particular neglect of a place where no one had truly lived for years. Dust gathered in corners like forgotten memories. Windows clouded with the residue of seasons passing unnoticed. The whole house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something that would never come. She started in the kitchen, the heart of any home. By noon of her first day, she'd scrubbed every surface until it gleamed, reorganized the shelves with the logic a working man could follow, and had bread rising and soup simmering. The familiar rhythms of housework steadied her nerves, gave her purpose. Chester proved surprisingly helpful, alerting her to a mouse nest behind the stove and a collection of spiders that had taken up residence in the pantry. His excited barking brought Samuel in from the barn, and he found Margaret standing on a chair, brandishing a broom at a particularly large spider. "It's the size of a dinner plate," she said, forgetting to be formal in her alarm. Samuel's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. He captured the spider in his hat and carried it outside. "Just a barn spider. They keep the flies down." "It can keep them down outside," Margaret said firmly, climbing down from the chair. Her face was flushed from exertion and embarrassment. "Yes, ma'am." This time she was certain she saw amusement in his eyes before he returned to his work. By evening, the kitchen looked like a different room. Samuel stopped in the doorway when he came in for supper, taking in the gleaming surfaces, the checked cloth she'd found in a drawer and pressed for the table, the wildflowers she'd gathered and placed in an old preserved jar. "You've been busy," he said carefully. "I hope you don't mind about the flowers. I found them growing near the well, and I thought, it's fine." He moved to the stove, lifted the lid on the pot. "Smells good." It was beef stew again, but Margaret had found herbs in the garden gone wild behind the house, rosemary and thyme struggling through the weeds. She'd added carrots from the root cellar, made dumplings from the last of the flour. When she served him, she noticed how he closed his eyes at the first bite, just for a moment. "My mother used to make dumplings," he said quietly. "Would you like me to leave the recipe for after I'm gone?" He looked up sharply, as if he'd forgotten her situation. "That won't be necessary." They ate in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Less hostile, more cautious, like two wild animals learning to share the same space. The second day, Margaret tackled the main room. She beat rugs, washed windows, polished the few pieces of furniture until they glowed. In a trunk shoved behind the settle, she found Treasure's embroidered pillows, a quilt in a wedding ring pattern, daguerreotypes in tarnished frames. She hesitated over these, unsure if she was overstepping. "Those were my mother's." She jumped, not having heard Samuel enter. He stood looking at the items spread on the floor, his face unreadable. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have—" "No, it's—" He picked up one of the photographs, a stern-faced man and a gentle-looking woman, with two young boys between them. "I packed these away after she died. Couldn't bear to look at them." "That's you and Thomas?" He nodded. "I was 12. He was 8. Pa had just bought this land. Ma cried for 3 days when she saw it. Nothing but grass and sky far as you could see. Thought she'd made a terrible mistake. But she hadn't. No, she came to love it. Said the sunsets made up for everything else." He set the photograph down carefully. "Do what you think best with these things." He left before she could respond. Margaret sat surrounded by the remnants of other lives, understanding suddenly that she wasn't the only one dealing with loss. The difference was, she'd lost a dream. Samuel had lost the reality. She put the photographs on the mantel, arranged the pillows on the settle, spread the wedding ring quilt over the back of a chair where the morning light would catch it. The room began to look like a place where people might actually live, rather than just exist. That evening, Samuel brought fresh venison from a hunting trip. Margaret had found a recipe book in a kitchen drawer, pages spotted and notes in the margins in a feminine hand. Following Mrs. Morrison's instructions, she made venison steaks with a wine reduction sauce, using some cooking wine she'd discovered hidden behind the vinegar. "This is—" Samuel paused, searching for words. "This is very fine, Miss Sullivan." "Margaret," she said impulsively, "if I'm to be here even for just one more day, you might as well call me Margaret." He considered this. "Samuel, then, though Sam is what most call me. Thomas called you Samuel in his letters. Thomas was formal like that, proper. Ma taught him his manners young, and they stuck." Sam cut another piece of meat, chewed thoughtfully. "He wrote about your cooking. Said you could make a feast from scraps. He was kind to say so. I learned from necessity mostly. When you have little, you learn to make it stretch. Practical skill. He approved, she could tell. Too many women come west expecting to maintain Eastern standards. They don't last. And what makes a woman last out here, do you think? He looked at her directly then, those sage green eyes serious. Grit, adaptability, the ability to find beauty in hard places, and he hesitated. And the wisdom to know when to bend so you don't break. It was the longest speech she'd heard from him. Margaret wondered if he was thinking of his mother, who'd cried for 3 days, then learned to love the sunsets. Chester chose that moment to emerge from wherever he'd been napping, stretching elaborately before padding over to Sam's chair. Without being asked, Sam reached down and scratched the little dog's head. "He's taken to you," Margaret observed. "Dogs are good judges of character." Sam's hand stilled. Thomas would have spoiled him rotten, always too soft-hearted with animals. There are worse faults in a man. Not out here. Soft hearts get you killed. Get others killed too. The bitterness was back, sharp as alkali. Margaret knew better than to push. She'd learned that much about Samuel Morrison. He'd give you glimpses of the man beneath the stone, but only on his terms. The third day dawned gray and restless, wind rattling the windows. Margaret woke with a sense of urgency. This was her last day. Tomorrow she'd need to leave, go to town, find some other arrangement. The thought made her stomach knot. She threw herself into cleaning the bedrooms upstairs, territories she hadn't yet invaded. Sam's room was Spartan, a bed, a chair, a rifle on pegs. She changed his sheets, swept the floor, tried not to notice the wedding photograph on the bureau of a much younger Sam with a pretty blonde woman. Thomas's room was harder. It remained exactly as he'd left it. Clothes still hung on pegs, books stacked on the bedside table. The top one was Sonnets from the Portuguese. Margaret's breath caught. She'd mentioned in one of her letters that it was her favorite. He must have ordered it specially. She cleaned around his things carefully, like tending a shrine. On his desk, she found the packet of her letters, tied with string. Beside them, several half-finished responses in his careful script. She didn't read them. It seemed too much like talking to ghosts. By afternoon, the wind had picked up to a proper blow. Margaret was taking wash off the line when she saw the rider approaching, a woman on a bay mare, riding with the confidence of someone born to the saddle. The woman dismounted in the yard, and Margaret recognized her from town, the pretty blonde who'd stood with the others at the station, whispering behind her glove. Up close, she was even lovelier, with cornflower eyes and perfect posture. "You must be the bride," the woman said without preamble. "I'm Catherine Winters. My father owns the Double Bar Ranch." Margaret Sullivan. Margaret's arms were full of sheets. Putting her at a disadvantage she suspected was intentional. "Is Samuel around?" "In the barn, I believe." Catherine's gaze swept over Margaret, taking in the simple work dress, the wisps of hair escaping from her bun, the redness of her hands from lye soap. "How industrious of you, though I can't imagine why Samuel allowed you to stay. He was kind enough to give me time to make arrangements." "Kind," Catherine laughed, a tinkling sound like broken glass. "That's not a word often applied to Samuel Morrison. You must have caught him in a weak moment." Chester appeared around the corner of the house, saw the stranger, and began barking furiously. Catherine stepped back, nose wrinkling. "What is that thing?" "My dog." Margaret set down the sheets, scooped up Chester. "He's protective." "Of what? There's nothing here worth protecting." Catherine's smile was sharp. "Certainly nothing of Thomas's." The cruelty of it took Margaret's breath. Before she could respond, Sam emerged from the barn, frowning at the commotion. "Catherine." His tone was carefully neutral. "What brings you out?" Catherine's whole demeanor changed, becoming soft and concerned. "I wanted to see how you were managing, Samuel. Such a difficult time, and now with—" She glanced at Margaret. "Additional complications." "I'm managing fine. Daddy wanted me to remind you about the harvest dance next week. You never come, but we keep hoping." She moved closer to him, had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "It would do you good to get out, see people. You can't mourn forever." Margaret watched Sam's face close off completely. Appreciate the thought. You'd best head back before this wind gets worse. Catherine pouted prettily. You're always sending me away. One might think you don't enjoy my company. One might think you'd take the hint. The words were harsh enough to make Catherine flush. Her eyes darted to Margaret, then back to Sam. I see. Well, don't say I didn't try to be neighborly. Though you might want to be careful, Samuel. People are already talking about this arrangement. A single man and woman under the same roof. It's not proper. Nothing improper about hiring help, Sam said flatly. Help? Catherine's laugh was brittle. Is that what we're calling it? She mounted her horse with practiced grace, looked down at them both. The offer stands about the dance, Samuel, when you tire of your domestic experiment. She rode off in a cloud of dust. Margaret found herself gripping Chester hard enough that he squirmed in protest. I'm sorry, she said to Sam. I've caused you trouble. Catherine Winters has been causing me trouble since her husband died 2 years back. He took the laundry basket from where she'd set it. Pay her no mind. She's very beautiful. So's a rattlesnake till it bites you. The unexpected humor surprised a laugh from Margaret. Sam's mouth quirked in response, and for a moment they stood there in the wind-torn yard, almost smiling at each other. I should tell you, Margaret said, the moment making her brave. I've inquired in town about work. Mrs. Hutchins at the boarding house might have a position next week, so I'll be able to leave as agreed. Something flickered across Sam's face. Disappointment? Relief? It was gone too quickly to read. That's good then, he said. That's good. He carried the laundry inside for her, the first time he'd done such a thing. Margaret followed, Chester at her heels, wondering why good news felt so much like defeat. That evening, their last together, Margaret outdid herself with supper. She'd found a precious tin of peaches in the pantry and made a cobbler, the kitchen sweet with cinnamon and memory. Sam ate 2 helpings, the closest to a compliment he'd given. My mother's recipe? He asked. From her book, yes. I hope you don't mind. No. He pushed back from the table, stood abruptly. I need to check the stock. But he paused in the doorway, not turning around. The house. It looks like it used to. Like when she was alive. Thomas would have... He stopped, cleared his throat. Thank you. He was gone before she could respond. Margaret cleaned the kitchen slowly, treasuring each familiar task. Tomorrow she'd be in town, begging for work, facing those cruel faces again. But tonight, just for tonight, she could pretend this was her kitchen, her home, her life. She was banking the stove when Sam returned. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, holding something. This was Thomas's, he said, extending a small leather journal. His plans for the ranch. Thought you might, that is, you inspired them. Seemed right you should have it. Margaret took the journal with trembling hands. Samuel, I couldn't... It's Sam, he corrected gruffly. And you can. No use to anyone gathering dust. She opened it carefully. Thomas's neat handwriting filled the pages. Sketches of barn improvements, lists of crops to try, dreams made tangible in ink. Her eyes burned with unshed tears. He was a good man, she whispered. The best. Sam's voice was rough. Better than this place deserved. Better than... He stopped, jaw clenching. Better than what? Nothing. Get some rest. I'll take you to town early. But Margaret had learned to read his silences. Better than you. Is that what you were going to say? He turned to leave, but she caught his sleeve. The muscle in his jaw jumped at her touch. You're a good man too, Samuel Morrison. Different from Thomas, but good all the same. This ranch, these 3 days, you've shown me more kindness than anyone since my parents died. Don't think I don't know what it cost you. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. For a moment, the stone mask slipped entirely. She saw grief there, and loneliness, and something else, something warm and surprised, and terribly fragile. Margaret, he said, and her name in his rough voice did strange things to her insides. Then Chester barked at something outside, breaking the spell. Sam stepped back, the mask sliding back into place. 5 o'clock, he said. Be ready. Margaret watched him go, her hand still warm from the contact. Outside, The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and doors. But inside, for just a moment, she'd felt the possibility of shelter. The wagon wheels seemed to turn too quickly on the road to town, each rotation bringing Margaret closer to an uncertain future. Sam drove in his customary silence, but she noticed he'd taken the longer route, following the creek instead of cutting straight across the prairie. Chester sat between them on the bench, occasionally looking up at one or the other as if wondering why everyone was so quiet. "There's something I should tell you," Sam said suddenly as the first buildings of Cedar Ridge came into view. "About Mrs. Hutchins." Margaret's hands tightened on her carpet bag. "Yes?" "She's particular about her boarders, likes them young and pretty, says it's good for business. The cattle drivers—" He cleared his throat. "Well, they pay extra for pleasant company at dinner." The implication hung between them like a physical thing. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I see. Just thought you should know." His knuckles were white on the reins. "Before you get your hopes up." They entered town from the east, passing the cemetery where Thomas lay beneath fresh-turned earth. Margaret glimpsed the wooden marker and quickly looked away, but not before Sam noticed. "Would you like to stop?" he asked quietly. "No." Then, softer, "Not yet. I'm not ready to say goodbye to someone I never got to say hello to." Main Street was busy for a Saturday morning. Ranchers in town for supplies, wives doing their marketing, children darting between wagons, and everyone, it seemed, stopped to stare as Sam's wagon rolled past. "Look, it's the despised bride," Margaret heard someone whisper. Still here after all. Bold as brass, riding beside him like that. Poor Sam. Thomas not even cold in his grave. Sam's jaw tightened with each comment, but he kept his eyes forward. It was Margaret who finally had enough. When Mrs. Foster emerged from the mercantile and fixed them with her disapproving glare, Margaret smiled and waved cheerfully. "Good morning, Mrs. Foster. Lovely day, isn't it?" The banker's wife spluttered, nearly dropping her parcels. Beside Margaret, Sam made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. "That wasn't wise," he murmured. "Perhaps not, but it felt good." They pulled up outside the boarding house, a 2-story building that had seen better days. The paint was peeling, and one shutter hung at a drunken angle. Mrs. Hutchins herself stood on the porch, arms crossed over her ample bosom. She was a hard-faced woman of 50, with hair dyed an unlikely shade of red and a calculating look in her eyes. "Mr. Morrison?" she said, ignoring Margaret entirely. "Come about the position, have you?" Sam climbed down, came around to help Margaret from the wagon. His hands lingered on her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Miss Sullivan is interested in the job you advertised." Mrs. Hutchins finally looked at Margaret, her gaze traveling from her sensible bonnet to her worn boots. "Is she now?" Her lip curled. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. The position has been filled." "Since yesterday?" Margaret asked. "When I sent my inquiry, you said—" "Things change." Mrs. Hutchins smiled unpleasantly. "A more suitable candidate presented herself this morning. You understand." Margaret understood perfectly. She opened her mouth to respond, but Sam beat her to it. "Then we'll try elsewhere." His hand was firm on her elbow, steering her back toward the wagon. "Good day, Mrs. Hutchins. Now, just a minute, Samuel Morrison." The boarding house keeper descended the steps, batting her false eyelashes. "There's no need to be hasty. I might have something for you. That ranch of yours must get awful lonely. A handsome man like you, all alone. I could—" "No." The word was flat, final. "Thank you." He practically lifted Margaret back onto the wagon seat, climbed up beside her, and drove off without a backward glance. Mrs. Hutchins stood in the street, face red with indignation. "Well," Margaret said after a moment, "that went well." Sam snorted. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge Society. Come on, we'll try the hotel." But the hotel owner took one look at Margaret and suddenly remembered he'd promised the job to his cousin's daughter. The mercantile wasn't hiring. The restaurant already had a cook. Even the laundry, where the lye fumes made Margaret's eyes water, claimed they had no need for additional help. By noon, they'd exhausted every possibility. They sat in the wagon outside the church, both silent. Chester had given up trying to cheer them and lay with his head on Margaret's lap, occasionally sighing deeply. There's still the saloon, Sam said finally. No. Margaret's voice was firm. I have some standards left. Then what will you do? She didn't answer because she didn't know. Return to Philadelphia in shame? She had no money for the journey? Throw herself on the church's charity? She'd rather starve. The church doors opened and Reverend Coleman emerged, followed by several members of his congregation. They were laughing at something, but the laughter died when they spotted the wagon. Miss Sullivan, the Reverend said, approaching with a careful smile. And Samuel. I'm surprised to see you both in town. Reverend. Sam touched his hat brim. I was just speaking with Mrs. Foster and Mrs. Wright about Christian charity, the Reverend continued. About helping those in need, especially women far from home. Margaret felt her spine stiffen. That's very kind, Reverend, but… Of course charity must be deserved, Mrs. Foster interrupted, joining them. Her daughter Constance stood beside her, pretty and pert in a blue dress that matched her eyes. And one must consider the moral implications. Moral implications? Margaret asked quietly. Well, my dear, you have been living unchaperoned with Mr. Morrison. Whatever the circumstances, it gives a certain impression. Mother, Constance said, but there was no real protest in it. Her eyes were fixed on Sam with an expression Margaret recognized. The same look Catherine Winters had worn. I've been employed as housekeeper, Margaret said clearly. Nothing more. Of course you have. Mrs. Foster's tone suggested otherwise. But you must understand, we have standards in Cedar Ridge. We can't simply accept any woman who arrives under questionable circumstances. Questionable? Sam's voice was dangerously quiet. Now, Samuel, Reverend Coleman said nervously. I'm sure Mrs. Foster didn't mean… She meant exactly what she said. Sam climbed down from the wagon, stood facing the group. Margaret had never seen him like this. Controlled fury radiating from every line of his body. A woman travels 3,000 miles to marry my brother, arrives to find him dead, and you call her circumstances questionable? We're only thinking of propriety, Miss Wright piped up. What will people say? They'll say what they always say, whatever makes them feel superior. Sam's eyes swept the group. You stand here preaching charity while turning away a decent woman who's asked for nothing but honest work. You should be ashamed. How dare you? Mrs. Foster began. I dare because I've watched you all for years, whispering behind your hands, judging everyone who doesn't meet your narrow standards. My mother faced it when she came here. Now Miss Sullivan faces it. And why? Because she doesn't look like what you expected? Because she had the audacity to survive disappointment? Constance Foster stepped forward, laying a hand on Sam's arm. Samuel, you're upset. Why don't you come to dinner tomorrow? We can discuss this calmly. I'm sure we can find a solution. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face. Your solution would be sending Miss Sullivan away, wouldn't it? Can't have competition. Constance flushed. I don't know what you mean. Don't you? Sam removed her hand, not ungently, but firmly. You and Catherine Winters and all the rest, circling like buzzards since Thomas died, thinking I need consolation, thinking I need a wife. Samuel. Reverend Coleman looked scandalized. This is neither the time nor place. You're right. Sam turned back to the wagon. We're leaving. He climbed up, took the reins. Margaret sat frozen beside him, aware of every eye upon her. As they drove away, she heard the explosion of whispers behind them. They were halfway back to the ranch before either spoke. You shouldn't have done that, Margaret said quietly. They're your neighbors. You have to live here. I've been living here my whole life. Never has done me much good being polite about it. But now they'll talk about you too. Say we're… Let them talk. He glanced at her. Though I suppose I should apologize. I didn't mean to make things worse for you. Worse? Margaret laughed, surprising herself. Mr. Morrison, Sam, I don't think they could get much worse. I'm already the despised bride, remember? You're not… He stopped, jaw working. You're not despised. Not by everyone. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. Margaret studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hair curled slightly over his collar. Not handsome in Thomas's easy way, but compelling, real. What will you do now? he asked as the ranch came into view. I don't know. The admission hurt. I suppose I'll have to wire my brother for money. Go back to Philadelphia, unless… She took a breath, gathered her courage. Unless you'd consider letting me stay longer, as your housekeeper, a proper business arrangement. I'll work for room and board until I can save enough to start over somewhere else. Sam was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, the house has never looked better than these past 3 days. The food's been good. Chester seems happy enough. Is that a yes? There'd be talk, more than already. There's already talk. At least this way, I'd be earning my keep instead of taking charity. He pulled up in the ranch yard, set the brake. You'd need your own space. The guest room's too close to mine for propriety. There's a cabin out back, old foreman's quarters, needs work, but it's solid. You could make it comfortable. Hope bloomed in Margaret's chest. You're serious? I'm always serious, but there was something almost soft in his eyes. We'd need to set terms. Wages when I can afford them. You'd handle the house, cooking, maybe help with the chickens. I wouldn't expect, that is, you'd be an employee. Nothing more. Of course. Margaret tried not to feel disappointed. What had she expected? This was business, survival, not a fairy tale. Then we have an agreement? He extended his hand. She shook it, trying to ignore how his calluses rasped against her palm. We have an agreement. Chester barked, as if adding his approval. Sam almost smiled. Come on then. Let's look at that cabin, see what needs doing. The foreman's cabin sat behind a stand of cottonwoods, small but sturdy. Dust and cobwebs covered everything, and the stove would need blacking, but Margaret could see its potential. One room with a sleeping alcove, a tiny kitchen area, a window facing the mountains. It's perfect, she said. Sam looked skeptical. It's a mess. It's private, independent, mine. She turned to him. When can I move in? Soon as we get it cleaned up. Day or two, maybe. Then I'd better get started. She rolled up her sleeves, and Sam found himself smiling, actually smiling at her determination. You're not quite what I expected, Margaret Sullivan. Good, she said, attacking a cobweb with the broom he'd fetched. I'm tired of being what people expect. As he watched her work, humming under her breath while Chester investigated mouse holes, Sam thought Thomas might have been right after all. Maybe Margaret Sullivan was exactly what this ranch needed. What he needed, though he'd never admit it aloud. But first, they had to survive the storm that was surely coming. Because in Cedar Ridge, going against social expectations was like spitting into the wind, and Sam had just declared war on the town's sensibilities. He only hoped they were both strong enough to weather what came next. The storm came 3 weeks later, just as Margaret had finally settled into the foreman's cabin. She'd made it cozy with cast-off furniture from the main house, rag rugs she'd braided from old clothes, and curtains sewn from flour sacks. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The first sign was the temperature drop. She woke that morning to find frost on the inside of her window, her breath visible in the cold air. Chester burrowed deeper under the quilts, only his nose showing. None of that, lazy bones, she said, hauling herself from the warm bed. We've got work to do. But when she opened the door, the wind nearly tore it from her hands. The sky was an ominous gray-green, clouds racing across it like wild horses. She'd learned enough about Colorado weather to know what that meant. She hurried to the main house, Chester struggling against the wind at her heels. Sam was already in the kitchen, coffee brewing, his face grim as he stared out the window. Blizzard coming, he said without preamble. Big one, from the look of it. We need to get the stock secured. What can I do? He glanced at her, seemed about to protest, then nodded. Help me drive the cattle into the near pasture. They'll need extra feed. Can you ride? Not well. You'll manage. Get your warmest clothes. Meet me at the barn. Margaret ran back to her cabin, pulled on every layer she owned, flannel petticoats, wool dress, Thomas's old coat she'd found in a trunk and altered to fit. She looked ridiculous, like a stuffed scarecrow, but vanity had no place in survival. Sam had already saddled a gentle mare named Buttercup. He helped Margaret mount, his hands steady on her waist. Just hold on and follow my lead, he said. She knows what to do. The next hours blurred together. The bite of wind on exposed skin, the bawling of cattle, the creak of saddle leather. Margaret clung to the saddle horn, terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. Sam worked his horse with an economy of motion that spoke of years of practice, whistling and calling to direct the herd. By the time they got the cattle settled, the first snow was falling, fat, heavy flakes that stuck to everything they touched. Sam dismounted and reached up to help Margaret down. Her legs nearly buckled, numb from cold and the unfamiliar exercise. "You did good," he said, and the approval in his voice warmed her more than any fire. Now comes the hard part. They spent the rest of the day in frantic preparation. Sam chopped wood while Margaret filled every available container with water. They moved what supplies they could from the outer buildings, secured shutters, brought in the chickens to the enclosed coop attached to the barn. "Your cabin won't hold in this," Sam said, as the wind began to howl in earnest. "You'll need to stay in the main house until it passes." Margaret wanted to protest. They'd been so careful about propriety these past weeks. But the wind was already strong enough to make walking difficult, and the snow was falling sideways. "Just until it passes," she agreed. They made it inside just as the full force of the storm hit. The house shook under the assault, windows rattling in their frames. Margaret had never experienced anything like it, the sheer rage of nature unleashed. "How long will it last?" she asked, feeding more wood into the stove. "No telling. Could be hours, could be days." Sam was checking the windows, making sure they were secure. "We've supplies enough, just have to wait it out." The first night was almost cozy. Margaret made a hearty stew from the beef and vegetables they'd stockpiled. They ate by lamplight while the storm raged outside. Chester curled between them like a small, hairy chaperone. "Tell me about winters here," Margaret said, trying to distract herself from the howling wind. "Are they all like this?" "Not all, but we get a few big storms each year. Pa lost half his herd our first winter. Nearly broke him." Sam stared into his coffee cup. "Ma wanted to go back east after that, but Pa was stubborn, said Morrison land was worth fighting for." "Was he right?" Sam looked up at her. "Some days I wonder. When Thomas was alive, I thought, well, it doesn't matter now." "You thought what?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Then, I thought maybe we could build something lasting. Him with his dreams and me with the work. Balance each other out. Now." He shrugged. "Now you have to do both," Margaret said softly. "Dream and work. I'm not much for dreaming." "No? Then why keep the ranch at all? You could sell, go somewhere easier." "Because—" He stopped, frustrated. "Because it's home. Because my parents are buried on that hill. Because Thomas loved it. Because—" He looked at her across the table, lamplight catching the gold flecks in his green eyes. "Because some things are worth the fight, even when you're tired of fighting." The wind gusted hard enough to shake the house, breaking the moment. They cleared the dishes in companionable silence. Then Sam showed Margaret to Thomas's old room. "I'll take the couch downstairs," he said. "If you need anything, I'll be fine." She hesitated. "Sam, thank you, for today, for letting me help." "You earned your keep." But his voice was warm. "Get some rest." Margaret lay in Thomas's bed. She couldn't think of it any other way, listening to the storm. The house creaked and groaned like a ship at sea. Somewhere in the walls, mice scurried for warmth. Chester pressed against her side, trembling slightly at each gust. She must have dozed, because she woke to a tremendous crash, glass breaking, Chester barking frantically. She stumbled from bed, grabbed the lamp, and hurried downstairs. Sam was already in the main room, snow swirling through a broken window. A branch from the big cottonwood had punched through, bringing wind and snow with it. "Get back!" he shouted over the howling gale. But Margaret was already moving, grabbing a tablecloth to help block the hole. Together they fought the branch back out, Sam holding a piece of boarding while Margaret handed him nails. The wind tried to tear the wood from his hands, but he muscled it into place, hammering with fierce concentration. When it was done, they stood panting in the sudden relative quiet. Snow dusted Sam's hair and shoulders. A cut on his hand bled freely. "You're hurt," Margaret said. "It's nothing. It's not nothing." She led him to the kitchen, made him sit while she fetched her sewing basket with its medical supplies. He watched her clean the wound, her face intent in the lamplight. "You've done this before," he observed. "My mother was the closest thing to a doctor in our neighborhood. I learned young." She wrapped a clean bandage around his hand, tied it off neatly. "There, try to keep it dry." "Margaret." His voice was odd. She looked up to find him staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Your hair." She reached up, felt the tangled mess where her braid had come undone. Snow was melting in it, making it curl wildly. "I must look a fright." "No." The word came out rough. "No, you don't." They stared at each other, the air between them suddenly charged with something that had nothing to do with the storm. Margaret became acutely aware of how close they were sitting, of the warmth radiating from his body, of the way his eyes had gone dark. "I should," she began. "Yes," he agreed, but neither moved. Chester chose that moment to wedge himself between them, whining for attention. The spell broke. Margaret stood quickly, nearly knocking over the chair. "I'll just check on the stove," she said. "I'll check the other windows." They retreated to opposite sides of the house, but the awareness lingered. Margaret fed the stove with shaking hands. What was wrong with her? This was her employer, her protector out of duty and nothing more. She couldn't afford to complicate things with feelings. The storm raged for 2 more days. They fell into a rhythm tending fires, melting snow for water, playing cards by lamplight when the darkness pressed too close. Sam taught her cribbage. She taught him to play chess with a set she found in Thomas's room. "You're better at this than I expected," he said on their 3rd game, when she nearly had him in checkmate. "Women can think strategically too, you know." "I'm learning that." On the 2nd night, with the wind howling like demons, Sam brought out a fiddle. "I didn't know you played," Margaret said, surprised. "Haven't in years, but the quiet's too loud, if that makes sense." She knew exactly what he meant. The storm created a strange isolation, as if they were the only 2 people left in the world. Sam tuned the instrument, then began to play, simple melodies at first, then more complex ones. Mountain songs, folk tunes, even a waltz that made Margaret's feet itch to dance. "My mother loved that one," he said. "Made Pa dance with her every Christmas, right here in this room. It's beautiful. Can you dance?" Yes, my father taught me." Sam set down the fiddle, stood, and offered his hand with formal courtesy. "Miss Sullivan, may I have this waltz?" She knew she should refuse. But the storm had created a world outside normal rules, and she found herself accepting. He hummed the melody as they danced, his hand warm on her waist, careful to maintain proper distance. Margaret had danced with men before, awkward boys at church socials, her brother's friends who pitied the spinster's sister. But never like this. Never with someone who moved with such surprising grace, who looked at her like she was worth looking at. "I misjudged you," Sam said quietly as they turned. "When you first came, you thought I was a burden, another problem to solve." "Yes." His honesty didn't sting as it might have. "I was wrong. He seemed to struggle for words. "You're stronger than you look, braver. You faced down a blizzard today like you were born to it. I was terrified, but you didn't let it stop you. That's what courage is." They'd stopped dancing but hadn't let go. Margaret looked up at him, saw something in his face that made her heart race. He was leaning closer, and she was letting him, and a log crashed in the stove, sending up a shower of sparks. They jumped apart like guilty children. "It's late," Margaret said breathlessly. "I should—" "Yes, good night." She fled upstairs, Chester at her heels, and spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, replaying that almost moment over and over. The 3rd morning dawned clear and still. The storm had blown itself out, leaving a world transformed. Snow drifted to the eaves in some places, while other spots were scoured bare. The mountains gleamed like crystal in the distance. Sam was already outside when Margaret came down, checking on the animals. She watched from the window as he waded through hip-deep snow, tossing hay to the cattle. He moved with purpose, but she caught him glancing toward the house. When he came in, cheeks red from cold, she had coffee and breakfast waiting. "Lost a few chickens," he reported. "But the cattle weathered it fine. Your cabin—" He hesitated. "The roof held, but there's damage." It'll need work before you can move back. Oh. Margaret tried to parse her feelings. Relief? Disappointment? Well, I can help with repairs once the snow melts. About that. Sam concentrated on his breakfast. Been thinking. Doesn't make sense, you trudging back and forth in weather. Waste of wood heating 2 places. You could, that is, the house has plenty of room. People would talk more than they already do. Let them. He looked up then, met her eyes squarely. I'm tired of living by their rules, tired of being alone in this house with nothing but ghosts. If you're willing to stay as housekeeper, he added quickly, I'd be grateful for the company. Margaret's heart was doing strange things in her chest. Just as housekeeper? Of course. What else? But there was something in his eyes that suggested more, something that matched the feeling building in her own chest. The storm had changed things between them, blown away some invisible barrier. Then I'll stay, she said softly. If you're certain. I'm certain. Outside, the sun climbed higher, setting the snow to sparkling like scattered diamonds. Inside, 2 lonely people sat at a kitchen table, sharing breakfast and the careful beginning of something neither quite dared to name. The blizzard had passed, but its effects would linger long after the snow melted. In the forced intimacy of those 3 days, Samuel Morrison and Margaret Sullivan had found something unexpected. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. And in the harsh land of Colorado Territory, sometimes possibility was enough to build on. Chester, for his part, was simply glad to be warm and fed. He curled up by the stove, tail wagging occasionally, perfectly content with the new arrangement. Dogs, after all, had always been wiser about such things than humans. Word traveled fast in Cedar Ridge, as it always did in small towns. Within a week of the blizzard, everyone knew that Margaret Sullivan had moved into the main house at the Morrison Ranch. The gossip spread like wildfire, growing more scandalous with each telling. It came to a head on a Thursday morning when Reverend Coleman arrived unannounced, accompanied by Mrs. Foster, Miss Wright, and 2 other prominent church ladies. Margaret saw them coming from the kitchen window, a delegation of righteousness marching up the snow-packed drive. Sam, she called quietly. He was mending harness in the dining room. We have visitors. He looked up, saw her expression, and went to the window. His face hardened. The Morality Brigade. Should I? You should do exactly what you always do. This is your home. He stood, setting aside the leather. I'll handle them. But Margaret lifted her chin. We'll handle them together. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps approval. He nodded once. They met the delegation on the porch. Reverend Coleman looked uncomfortable, but the ladies wore expressions of scandalized determination. Mrs. Foster naturally took the lead. Mr. Morrison, Miss Sullivan, she said, managing to make Margaret's name sound like something scraped off a boot. We've come on a matter of Christian concern. Then you'd best come in out of the cold, Sam said evenly. Margaret, would you put on coffee? That won't be necessary, Mrs. Foster said quickly. This isn't a social call. No, Sam agreed. I can see that. Say your piece then. Reverend Coleman cleared his throat. Samuel, the congregation is concerned about the current arrangement. An unmarried man and woman living under the same roof. Miss Sullivan is my housekeeper, Sam interrupted. She has her own quarters, earns honest wages. Nothing improper about it. Come now, Miss Wright tittered nervously. Surely you can see how it looks. The whole town is talking. The whole town talks regardless, Margaret said quietly. They talked when I arrived, talked when I sought work, talked when Mr. Morrison showed me Christian kindness. Perhaps the problem isn't with us, but with those who see sin where none exists. Mrs. Foster's face flushed. How dare you lecture us on Christian behavior? You, who came here under false pretenses. What false pretenses? Sam's voice had gone dangerously quiet. She came to marry my brother. He died. She stayed to work. Where's the deception? She misrepresented herself, Mrs. Foster insisted. Poor Thomas expected. You didn't know Thomas, Sam cut her off. I did. He would have married Margaret exactly as she is, because he saw what you're all too blind to see, a good woman with a kind heart and a strong spirit. Be that as it may, Reverend Coleman interjected, trying to restore calm. The appearance of impropriety. Then we'll fix the appearance, Sam said suddenly. Everyone stared at him. He turned to Margaret, something wild and decisive in his eyes. "Marry me." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Margaret felt the porch tilt beneath her feet. "What? You heard me." He faced her fully now, ignoring their audience. "Marry me, not for them, not for propriety. For us, for the ranch, for—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "Because I'm tired of pretending I don't wake up looking forward to seeing you at breakfast. Tired of acting like having you here hasn't made this place feel like home again." "Samuel," Reverend Coleman said weakly, "this is highly irregular." "Quiet," Sam said without looking at him. "Margaret?" She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. This wasn't how proposals happened. Not in front of hostile witnesses, not born from defiance rather than romance. And yet his eyes were sincere. His hands, when he reached for hers, were steady despite the risk he was taking. This difficult, closed-off man was laying his heart bare in front of people who would mock him for it. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, lifting her chin. "Yes, I'll marry you." Mrs. Foster made a sound like an offended hen. "This is absurd. You can't simply—" "We can and we will," Sam said firmly. "Reverend, you came here worried about propriety? Fine, make it proper. Marry us. Now." The Reverend looked faint. "Why wait? Unless—" Sam's eyes glinted. "Unless you have some objection to performing the Lord's sacrament?" It was a trap neatly sprung. Reverend Coleman couldn't refuse without admitting his concern had never been about propriety, but about Margaret herself. He hemmed and hawed, but eventually nodded. "I'll need to fetch my book from the church." "Then fetch it," Sam said. "We'll wait." The church ladies left in a flutter of outrage, but the Reverend returned within the hour, looking resigned. Margaret had time to pin up her hair properly and change into her best dress. Still plain, still mended, but clean. Sam had put on his Sunday shirt. They stood in the parlor, in front of the fireplace where Sam's parents had once stood for their own wedding. Chester sat at Margaret's feet, tail wagging as if he understood the importance of the moment. The Reverend read the service with obvious reluctance, but he read it. "Do you, Samuel, take this woman?" "I do." Sam's voice was firm, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "Do you, Margaret, take this man?" "I do." Her voice shook slightly, but her gaze was steady. "Then by the power vested in me." Reverend Coleman sighed deeply. "I pronounce you man and wife." Sam kissed her then, a brief press of lips that somehow held promise. When they parted, Margaret saw something in his face she'd never seen before. Joy, fleeting but real. "I'll file the certificate," the Reverend said stiffly. "May God have mercy on you both." After he left, they stood awkwardly in the parlor, the magnitude of what they'd done settling over them. "I'm sorry," Sam said finally. "That I should have asked you properly, privately." "Why did you?" Margaret asked. "Really?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because when they attacked you, I realized something. I've been alone so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to want to protect someone, to have someone worth protecting." He met her eyes. "And because I meant what I said. These past weeks, having you here, it's been like watching the sun rise after a long night." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Sam. I know I'm not Thomas. I'm not romantic or gentle or—" She stopped him with a hand on his arm. "You're you. That's enough." He covered her hand with his. "We'll make this work. I promise. It won't be a marriage in name only, but I won't rush you either. We'll take our time, build something real." "I'd like that." The news of their sudden marriage spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. Some were scandalized. Others, remembering Sam's fierce defense of Margaret, were oddly approving. But the couple at the Morrison Ranch paid little attention to town gossip. They settled into a new rhythm. Margaret moved her things into the main bedroom. Sam insisted, taking the smaller room for himself, "until you're comfortable." They shared meals, shared chores, shared quiet evenings by the fire. Slowly, carefully, they began sharing more. 2 weeks after their marriage, Margaret found Sam in the barn, brushing down his horse with unusual vigor. "What's wrong?" she asked. He glanced at her, jaw tight. "Ran into Catherine Winters in town. She had some things to say about our marriage." Ah, Margaret could imagine. And And I told her she could take her opinions and—" He stopped, moderated his language. "I told her to mind her own business. That must have gone well." Despite his mood, Sam's mouth quirked. She turned an interesting shade of purple. Margaret laughed, and after a moment, Sam joined her. It felt good to laugh together, to face the world's disapproval as a team. "I have something for you," he said suddenly, reaching into his pocket. "I know we did things backward, but—" He pulled out a simple gold band. It was my mother's. I thought, if you'd like. Margaret's throat tightened. "Oh, Sam, it's perfect." He slipped it onto her finger, his hands gentle. "I'm not good with words like Thomas was, but I want you to know, I'm glad you stayed. Glad you said yes." "So am I," she whispered. That night, for the first time, Margaret knocked on Sam's door. "The bed's too big," she said simply. "Too cold." He looked at her for a long moment, then held open the covers. She slipped in beside him, Chester jumping up to curl at their feet. They lay carefully apart at first, but during the night, they drifted together. Margaret woke to find Sam's arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder. It felt like coming home. A month later, Reverend Coleman arrived again, this time alone and looking genuinely troubled. "I owe you both an apology," he said, hat in hand. "I let the town's prejudices guide me instead of God's word. You've proved everyone wrong, showing what a true Christian marriage should be, built on respect, kindness, and genuine affection." Sam was inclined to send him away, but Margaret touched his arm. "Thank you, Reverend. That means a great deal. The congregation, some of them would like to welcome you properly. If you'd consider coming to services." Margaret looked at Sam, let him decide. He sighed. "We'll think about it." They did attend eventually. Faced with the reality of their obvious happiness, even the strongest critics gradually quieted. Margaret's warm nature won over the children first, then their mothers. Sam's protective pride in his wife earned the men's respect. "You did it," Sam murmured one Sunday as they walked home from church. "You conquered Cedar Ridge." "We did it," Margaret corrected. "Together." He stopped walking, turned to face her. "Margaret, I need to tell you something." Her heart stuttered. "What?" "I love you." The words came out rushed, as if he'd been holding them back too long. "I know we married for convenience, but somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you. Your strength, your kindness, the way you hum when you cook, how you've made this house alive again. I love you." Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks. "I love you too. I think I have for weeks. I just didn't dare hope." He kissed her then, there on the road with the mountains watching. Kissed her like a man who'd found water in the desert. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "Come on, Mrs. Morrison," he said, grinning wider than she'd ever seen. "Let's go home." They walked hand in hand back to the ranch, Chester trotting ahead, tail high. The woman who'd arrived as the despised bride had become the respected wife, proving that sometimes the best things came from the worst circumstances. And in the kitchen that night, as Margaret prepared dinner and Sam played his fiddle, the house filled with music and laughter and love, exactly as Thomas had dreamed it would, just not quite the way he'd imagined. Spring came late to Colorado that year, but when it arrived, it transformed the Morrison Ranch into something from a fairy tale. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in purple and gold, and the air hummed with new life. Margaret stood in what had been Mrs. Morrison's garden, now restored to neat rows of vegetables and herbs, planning where to put the roses she'd ordered from Denver. "You sure those will grow here?" Sam asked, coming up behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, a gesture that had become natural over the winter months. "Your mother grew them," Margaret pointed out, leaning back against his chest. "I found her journal in the attic. She had 3 varieties along the south wall." "Hmm?" He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Speaking of the attic, I've been thinking. That space could be converted, made into a proper room. Children need their own spaces." Margaret stilled. They'd been married 6 months now, and while their love had grown deep and true, they'd never discussed children. "Sam," he turned her to face him, his eyes serious. "I know we didn't start this marriage conventionally, but I want everything with you, Margaret. A real family. children to carry on this place. If you want that too. She thought of all the reasons to say no, her age, her health, the harshness of ranch life. Then she thought of a little boy with Sam's green eyes, a little girl with his stubborn chin, and her heart swelled. I want that too, she whispered. His kiss was answer enough. They decided to renew their vows properly with a real wedding this time, not for the town's sake, but for theirs. Margaret wrote to her brother in Philadelphia, not asking for anything but simply informing him of her marriage. To her surprise, he wrote back with congratulations and a bank draft. A wedding gift, the letter said, and an apology for not believing you could find happiness. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in May. This time, Margaret had a proper dress. Not white, which would have been inappropriate for a widow, but a soft blue that brought out her eyes. Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile, won over by Margaret's steady kindness, offered to help with the fitting. You've changed, the older woman said, pinning a hem. When you first arrived, you looked defeated. Now you glow. Love will do that, Margaret said simply. It's more than that. You've grown into yourself, found your place. Mrs. Henderson smiled. Sam's changed too. Never saw him smile before you came along. The morning of the wedding dawned perfect clear skies, warm breeze, the mountains standing witness in the distance. Margaret woke early, too excited to sleep. She found Sam already up, standing on the porch with his coffee. Bad luck to see the bride before the wedding, she teased. We make our own luck, he said, pulling her close. Besides, I wanted to give you something. He handed her a small wrapped package. Inside was a cameo brooch, delicate and beautiful. It was my grandmother's, he explained. Came all the way from Ireland. Ma wore it at her wedding, and her mother before that. Margaret's eyes filled. Oh, Sam, it's beautiful. So are you. He touched her cheek gently. I want you to know, before we do this again in front of everyone, you saved me, Margaret. I was turning to stone in this place, frozen in grief and anger. You brought me back to life. We saved each other, she corrected, standing on her toes to kiss him. The ceremony was held in the meadow behind the house, with wildflowers as decoration and the mountains as cathedral. This time the whole town was invited, and most came. Even Mrs. Foster, though she looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. Reverend Coleman, now genuinely supportive, performed the service with real joy. Margaret walked down an aisle made of ranch hands and neighbors, Chester trotting beside her with a ribbon around his neck. Sam waited at the end, looking handsome in his new suit, his eyes bright with emotion. Dearly beloved, Reverend Coleman began, we gather today to celebrate what God has already joined together, a union born of adversity, but strengthened by love. This time, when they said their vows, they added their own words. Sam went first, his voice steady despite the emotion in it. Margaret, you came here for another man, but you stayed for me. You saw past my walls, my grief, my stubbornness. You made this house a home and this man whole again. I promise to love you, protect you, and stand beside you through whatever comes. You are my sunrise, my spring after winter, my answered prayer. Margaret had to blink back tears before she could speak. Sam, you offered me shelter when I had nowhere to go. You gave me purpose when I felt lost. You showed me that love doesn't always come as we expect it. Sometimes it grows slowly, quietly, until one day you realize it's become as essential as breathing. I promise to love you, support you, and build this life with you. You are my safe harbor, my true north, my unexpected blessing. When Reverend Coleman pronounced them husband and wife, again, Sam kissed Margaret with a tenderness that had several ladies reaching for their handkerchiefs. Even some of the ranch hands looked suspiciously misty-eyed. The reception was held in the yard, with tables groaning under the weight of food the neighboring women had brought. It seemed the whole county had decided to celebrate the union they'd once condemned. Sam and Margaret moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations, sharing smiles. I believe I owe you an apology, Catherine Winters said stiffly, approaching during a quiet moment. She looked beautiful as always, but there was something pinched about her expression. I misjudged the situation. We all make mistakes, Margaret said graciously. Catherine's smile was rueful. You're kinder than I deserve. I hope you'll both be very happy. After she left, Sam shook his head. Will wonders never cease? People can change, Margaret said. We're proof of that. As the sun began to set, Sam pulled out his fiddle. Other instruments appeared, a guitar, a harmonica, even a washboard. Soon the yard filled with music and dancing. Margaret danced with Sam, with the ranch hands, even with Reverend Coleman. But she always returned to her husband's arms. Happy? Sam asked as they swayed together under the stars. More than I ever dreamed possible. Even though you came here for Thomas? Margaret was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. I'll always be grateful to Thomas. His letters brought me here. But Sam, I think I was always meant to find you. Thomas was the dream. You're the reality. And reality with you is better than any dream. He spun her around, making her laugh. Mrs. Morrison, you've turned me into a romantic fool. Good. Someone needs to write poetry about these mountains. I'll leave that to you. I'll just keep the ranch running so you have time to write. They discussed this during the winter. Margaret's love of writing, her secret ambition to document life in the West. Sam had already cleared a corner of the parlor for a writing desk, encouraging her dream as she encouraged his. The party lasted until late, but eventually the guests departed, leaving the newlyweds alone. They stood on the porch, watching the last wagon disappear into the darkness. No regrets? Sam asked. Not one. Margaret turned in his arms. Though I do have one question. What's that? When you proposed, that day on the porch with Reverend Coleman and the others, was it really just to spite them? Or did you already? Sam was quiet for a long moment. I think I'd been wanting to ask you for weeks. Maybe since the blizzard. But I was too scared, too convinced you'd say no. When they attacked you, when I saw how they made you feel small. His jaw tightened. I couldn't stand it. And suddenly I realized I had the power to change everything, to make you mine, protect you, give you the respect you deserved. So yes, it was spite, but it was also the truest thing I'd ever done. Margaret kissed him softly. I'm glad you were spiteful. Come on, wife, let's go home. They walked into the house hand in hand. In the parlor, the wedding gifts were piled high, practical things, mostly tools and fabric and preserves. But on the mantel sat two photographs, one of Sam's parents on their wedding day, and now one of Sam and Margaret taken that afternoon by a traveling photographer. We look happy, Margaret said, studying their faces. We are happy. Sam pulled her close, and we're just getting started. Later, as they lay together in the bed they now properly shared, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her here. A widow before she was a wife, despised before she was beloved, lost before she was found. It hadn't been the path she'd planned, but it had led her home. I love you, Sam Morrison, she whispered into the darkness. And I love you, Margaret Morrison, he replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. Forever and then some. Outside, Chester curled up on his favorite porch chair, keeping watch over his domain. The ranch settled into peaceful sleep, and somewhere in the distance, a nightingale began to sing. Unusual for Colorado. But then, unusual things happened when love found its way home. The despised bride had become the cherished wife, proving that sometimes the best endings come from the most difficult beginnings. And in the Morrison Ranch, where sorrow had once reigned, joy now made its home. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, carried by a young woman who looked travel-worn and uncertain. Margaret was in the garden, harvesting the last of the summer vegetables, when she saw the stranger approaching on foot from the direction of town. Mrs. Morrison, the young woman called out. She couldn't have been more than 19, with dark hair escaping from beneath a shabby bonnet and clothes that spoke of hard times. Yes? Margaret straightened, one hand going instinctively to her lower back. At 5 months along, her condition was becoming obvious, and her back protested the garden work. My name is Grace Sullivan. Grace Thompson now, I suppose. The girl's voice shook. I'm your niece, your brother James's daughter. Margaret nearly dropped the basket of tomatoes. Grace? Little Grace? But you were only 10 when I left Philadelphia. I'm 19 now, Aunt Margaret. Tears spilled down the girl's cheeks. I'm sorry to come like this, without warning, but I didn't know where else to go. Margaret set down her basket and hurried forward, catching the girl as she swayed. Come inside, child. You look ready to drop. In the kitchen, over tea and bread with butter, Grace's story emerged. James had died of influenza the previous winter, followed quickly by his wife. Grace had married hastily, a man who promised security but delivered only cruelty. He drank, Grace said quietly, staring into her teacup. And when he drank, he wasn't kind. When I found your letter and Father's things about your marriage, your new life here, I ran, took what little money I could find and bought a train ticket. Does he know where you've gone? Sam asked. He'd come in from the barn, drawn by the unusual voices. Grace shook her head. I told no one. I remembered Aunt Margaret being so kind when I was small. I hoped. She trailed off, looking lost. Margaret reached across the table, grasped her niece's hand. You did right to come. You'll stay here with us, for as long as you need. Sam nodded agreement. The foreman's cabin is empty and repaired. You can have privacy there, but take your meals with us. There's always work on a ranch if you're willing. Grace burst into tears, the relieved sobs of someone who'd held fear inside too long. Margaret gathered her close, meeting Sam's eyes over the girl's head. He nodded again, understanding. They'd take this wounded bird under their wing, just as he'd once sheltered Margaret. Within days, Grace had settled into ranch life with an eagerness that spoke of her desperate need for stability. She was quick to learn, eager to help, and gentle with the animals. Chester adopted her immediately, often splitting his time between Margaret and his new friend. She's healing, Margaret observed one evening, watching Grace play with Chester in the yard. Takes time, Sam replied, his arm around Margaret's expanding waist. But this place is good for healing. I should know. October brought the first frost and a revelation. Margaret had noticed Grace's pallor, her morning sickness, the way she turned from certain foods. When she gently confronted her niece, the girl broke down. I'm with child, Grace sobbed. His child. I didn't know when I left, and now, what am I going to do? No decent man will want me. I'll be ruined just like... She stopped, horrified. Just like me? Margaret asked gently. I came here as a mail-order bride to a dead man, remember? The whole town called me the despised bride, but look at me now. She took Grace's hands, placed them on her own rounded belly. We make our own definitions of ruin and redemption out here. You're not ruined. You're a young woman who escaped a bad situation to protect herself and her child. That takes courage. But what will people say? Let them say what they will. We'll tell them you're a widow. Your husband died of fever back east. It's close enough to truth. The man you married is dead to you now. Sam agreed with the plan, his protective instincts extending to Grace as naturally as they had to Margaret. The town, already accustomed to the Morrison Ranch harboring unexpected women, accepted the story with minimal gossip. As autumn progressed, the two pregnant women supported each other through the discomforts and fears. Margaret, further along, could reassure Grace about what to expect. Grace, young and resilient, helped with household tasks that were becoming difficult for Margaret. We're quite a pair, Grace laughed one day, both women working to preserve the last of the garden harvest. The despised bride and the runaway wife. Former despised bride, Margaret corrected with a smile. Now I'm the respected Mrs. Morrison, thank you very much. It was true. The transformation was complete. When Margaret went to town now, women sought her advice on recipes and remedies. Men tipped their hats respectfully. Even Mrs. Foster had been seen purchasing one of Margaret's apple pies at the church bazaar. November brought an early snow and Margaret's labor. It started at dawn, and by noon, Sam was pacing the floor like a caged wolf, while Grace and Mrs. Henderson attended to Margaret upstairs. First babies take time, Mrs. Henderson said calmly. But Sam wasn't calm. He'd lost too much already. Parents, brother. The thought of losing Margaret. She's strong, Grace assured him during one of her trips downstairs for more water. Stronger than she looks. Just before sunset, a cry pierced the air, not Margaret's, but the high, indignant wail of a newborn. Sam took the stairs 3 at a time, bursting into the room to find Margaret propped against pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a bundle. Come meet your son, she said softly. A son. Sam approached slowly, as if in a dream. The baby was perfect, tiny fists waving, face red with the outrage of being born. When Sam touched one little hand, the baby grasped his finger with surprising strength. "What shall we call him?" Margaret asked. Sam's throat was tight. "Thomas, for the brother who brought you to me." "Thomas James Morrison," Margaret smiled. "For both brothers who led me home." Grace's daughter arrived 2 months later in the depths of January. They named her Hope for what she represented. New beginnings, second chances, the future stretching bright before them. The ranch thrived with new life. Sam built a larger chicken coop to accommodate Grace's growing flock. Margaret's garden expanded, providing not just for the family, but surplus to sell in town. The house rang with baby cries and laughter, Chester appointing himself guardian of both infants. Spring brought unexpected visitors, a lawyer from Denver with papers requiring signatures. "It seems," the lawyer explained, "that a Mr. William Thompson of Philadelphia has died, fell downstairs in a drunken state. His wife, Grace Thompson, is his only heir." Grace went pale. "I don't want anything from him." "Nevertheless, there's a small inheritance, enough to provide security for you and your daughter." After the lawyer left, Grace sat stunned. "I'm free," she whispered. "Truly free." "You were free the moment you stepped on that train," Margaret said firmly. "This just makes it official." With her small inheritance, Grace could have gone anywhere, started fresh in a bigger city. But when Sam offered to sell her a parcel of land adjoining the ranch, she accepted immediately. "This is home now," she said simply. "For both of us." They built a small house for Grace and Hope, close enough for daily visits, but allowing independence. Grace started a business raising chickens and selling eggs, her confidence growing with each passing month. On a warm evening in May, the extended family gathered on the main house porch. Sam played his fiddle while Margaret held Thomas, now crawling everywhere. Grace bounced Hope on her knee, singing along. Chester, showing his age now, dozed contentedly at their feet. "I received interesting news from town today," Sam said during a pause in the music. "Catherine Winters is engaged. To a banker from Denver." "Good for her," Margaret said sincerely. "I hope she finds happiness." Mrs. Foster is beside herself with joy. Apparently, it's quite the society match. They shared amused glances, remembering when such gossip would have stung. Now it was merely entertainment, distant from their full, rich life. "You know what I've been thinking?" Margaret said suddenly. "We should write it down, all of it, how we came here, what we've built. For the children, so they know their story. The tale of the despised bride," Sam teased. "The tale of the beloved wife," Margaret corrected. "And the cowboy who said stay." Grace raised her teacup. "Two unlikely families and unexpected blessings." "To home," Sam added, pulling Margaret closer. "To love," Margaret finished, "in all its forms." They sat together as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The ranch spread before them, not just land and buildings, but a sanctuary for wounded hearts, a place where the despised became cherished, where the broken became whole. Chester lifted his graying head, tail wagging as if he too approved of how things had turned out. After all, he'd been there from the beginning, when a scared woman stepped off a train with nothing but hope and a broken heart. Now that woman was the center of a family, the heart of a home, proof that sometimes the best lives grow from the rockiest soil. As stars began to appear in the Colorado sky, Margaret whispered a prayer of gratitude. She'd come west for one man and found another. She'd arrived despised and discovered love. She'd been empty and was now full to overflowing. "What are you thinking?" Sam asked softly. "That I came here with nothing but a dog and a broken heart," she said. "And look what grew from that." He kissed her temple. "You came with more than that. You came with courage and kindness and the ability to see beyond the surface. You came with everything that matters." Inside the house, Thomas began to fuss. Grace stood to help, but Margaret waved her back. "Finish your tea. I'll see to him." She rose, her hand trailing across Sam's shoulder as she passed. In the doorway, she paused, looking back at her family. Chosen and cherished, built from loss but stronger for it. I came here despised, she murmured, echoing the words she'd said so many times. But you said stay, and now this is home. Forever and always. Home. Thank you for listening to this story. Where are you enjoying this tale from? Please share in the comments below. We'd love to connect with listeners from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Margaret and Sam's journey. Your comments and stories make our community special.